So I'm going to entertain you for a little while here with my stories from Papua New Guinea while I was on exchange with the Royal Australian Survey Corps back in the 70s. It's almost 40 years ago now, so in advance I'll apologize to the geo people about the level of technology I'm dealing with, because that world changes so rapidly, and you'll see some of the roots of the current technology. So I've interspersed it with a little bit of survey work, if you will, and then half of it's kind of a National Geographic, because the country of Papua New Guinea is still one of the least explored, most remote countries in the world. Totally inaccessible. Basically, the Royal Australian Survey Corps doesn't exist any longer. Their roots are with the Royal Australian Engineers. There was a small survey section. They took over to form the Corps into its own right, because essentially it became the, if you will, the national mapper of the country of Australia. There was no civilian counterpart, so the military took on that role up until the 90s, when the Corps stood down, and the geo folks are kind of like our geo. They're embedded within the Corps of Engineers. So I was there for a 2-year posting on exchange. One of the lucky people from MCE that when we did have that exchange posting, I was posted to the regiment. I'll explain their structure here in a minute, in Bendigo, Victoria, and that's kind of like their headquarters, sort of like Booth Street. All the base plant stuff, computers, photogrammetry, printing. And I sort of, as a young single guy, asked if I could do something more exciting. So they, within it, believe it or not, within a foreign posting, they posted me internally to one of their active field squadrons, who was about to launch off into Papua New Guinea for the next 6 or 8 months. I'll just kind of christen the ground here for you. Not too many people are really familiar with this particular remote country. It is the second largest island in the world after Greenland. It's on the equator. From about 0 degrees here down to about 10 or 12 degrees south of the equator there. Very tropical, as you would expect. Although in the southern area down here, there's a big long river called the Fly River that goes up, and the Sepik River in the north that is sea level swampland, mosquitoes and all kinds of bad critters underfoot. And then there's a ridge that goes all the way through the island of New Guinea that goes up to 15,000 feet. And actually on the Indonesian side over here, Mount Wilhelm is about 15,000 feet above sea level. So you get the full range of a tropical country, from swamps all the way up to glaciers. It's also on the Ring of Fire in the South Pacific, so that the tectonic plates here are rubbing against each other constantly. And we were under canvas all the time, of course, and I remembered one day being a Canadian in this unfamiliar territory, how easily you can adapt to things like earthquakes, because it was, I wouldn't even say it's a daily occurrence, it was an hourly occurrence. And it never dawned on me until one day I was walking down the tent lines, and for fire safety, outside of each tent we had little water buckets, and I didn't know there was an earthquake until I saw the water shaking and lapping like that, and I didn't even feel it, because I'd been so used to it at that point. Our main base was in Goroka, which is in the highlands up around here, and our primary function was to do operations along the border with Iri and Jaya, and in the southern regions there. So I'll just kind of give you a geopolitical situation, if you wouldn't mind, for a minute. This is 1974. It's the post-Vietnam War era. Australians, of course, with Vietnam on their doorstep, were involved in a combat role in Vietnam in the day. And the politics of the day was the fear of creeping communism, and it's part of the reason why the U.S. got involved in all the rest. But basically, they were worried about communism from Russia to China to Indochina, Indonesia, and over here. And the reason that was of significance to us was that it was the era of the end of colonialism. So the UN had been pushing Britain, France, and Belgium and other countries to finally get rid of all their colonies that they had spread around, and there was a big move to grant independence. New Guinea was a UN trust territory to Australia, so the pressure was on Australia to give it up, and they were ordered to get out by 1975. So our operation in 1974 was much larger than a normal survey operation, and part of it was to get that country map, because it's right on their doorstep, and the old theory of the domino effect of falling dominoes of communism coming down to Australia was still very much on the horizon. New Guinea itself has been colonized by the Germans, by the Dutch, and by the British, and then finally by the Australians. And in World War II, the Japanese occupied the northern part of New Guinea, and there are a lot of stories about the famous battles of the Australians fighting against the Japanese on the northern side of the island with the support of the natives that helped us sort of stretcher-bearer role. There's a lot of history about the Australian regiments fighting the Japanese in World War II. So here's a few factoids about this place. It's an amazing place with over 800 counted languages in 1974. God knows how many there are now. It's totally inaccessible. We're dealing with Stone Age people that live in villages, and there could be one 20 or 30 kilometers away, and they've never been there. There's no way to get from one place to another. There's one dirt road that goes through the middle of the country from Port Moresby, the capital, up into the highlands, but other than that, there's nothing. So the tribes that are there have kind of lived for centuries with tribal warfare being the main part of their life. So it's very much a warry people, although when I'll show you some of the pictures, you'll see when I talk war, I'm talking bows and arrows here. Maybe later I can tell you about some of the customs that they have there, some of the cults that occurred as a result of the Japanese in World War II. There was a case in the newspaper, I read it because I'm sensitive to New Guinea, I think a couple of months ago, 3-4 months ago, about cannibalism and picking up people and charging them with murder because they had cannibalized some of the people that they had captured, so it still happens. They do believe in ancestor worship or not, I'll talk about that. One of my jobs when I was there was to brief the incoming Australians when they were arriving on our operation, and part of the briefing was telling them what to expect. Payback was their legal way of looking at life. They don't have any legal system, so it's an eye for an eye kind of culture. So the value systems in New Guinea amongst the tribes are dogs and pigs and women in that order. And we were told if anybody goes out in a jeep or in a vehicle or manages to run over a dog, get the hell out of there as quick as you can, because somebody will come in with their machete and chop you to bits, because if you kill that dog, payback means you die too. So it's part of my in-country briefing. The Kokoda Trail was the part of New Guinea where the Aussies fought the Japanese, famous battles there. I put up 3 Royal Australian Regiment and 2 PPCLI because I know you guys had a talk, and I wasn't here, about the Korean conflict recently. We had with us a bunch of infantry people, and I'll explain that. They were from 3 RAR, and they were all very, very proud of they wore the U.S. presidential citation on their uniforms because of the battle that they fought together in Kapyong in Korea. So I was, as a Canadian, I was welcomed by these infantry people. I've gone through the thing. Sukarno and Suharto in Indonesia, at that time they were kind of leaning to the west, but they were wavering. So that's why this communist concept was very much on the minds of people, because as I've shown you, the island is split. Half of it is Irian Jaya, which is a province of Indonesia, and the other half is what we call Papua New Guinea. And the fear was that if the Indonesians went communist, then they would take over the entire island, and as you might have realized, you can actually see New Guinea from the tip of the Torres Strait and the top of Queensland, so it's very, very close to Australia. It's about 1,000 kilometers top to bottom. So here's where I came from. Op Arctic 71 was my first foray into the survey world, and headed up to the Arctic, so that's why I wanted to get back to the field. This is a different scenario than what I'm looking at now. We, in those days, would send up Chinooks from 450 Heavy Lift Squadron that was based at CFB Uplands at the time, and we would cache fuel all across the Arctic, and people are still trying to clean up our mess. And you can see the engineer oil drums outside. In my case, we had civilian charter helicopters to do the survey, based out of normally some site on the Dew Line is our main base, and we'd operate out of there. So this is the background that I came from and our kind of geography. I only show this picture, but that's my MWO Paul Barilla, who was our Camp Sergeant Major, because you see those oil drums in the snow in the back. Our problem in the Arctic is that when we come to a fuel cache, the drums would be put out on the ground 5 or 6 in a row, and then another layer on top of it, and you couldn't exceed 3. But the bottom layer was always frozen solid, so you really only had access to the top because there's no way you could bust through. A different story in New Guinea, because when we came to a fuel cache there, the drums are all laid out. You're in the jungle, and snakes loved to live in the little spot that's between two oil drums together. So nobody ever wanted to touch the bottom row of the oil drums when they had to refuel their helicopters or whatever. So from the Arctic, I was faced with this. It's snakes in trees and snakes in the ground, lizards all over the place. Well, this one is actually in Australia. I don't think they're indigenous to New Guinea, but I took that in Queensland, so it's pretty close. And luckily, these guys are vegetarians, so we didn't have to worry too much about them. Just, they were all over the place. As I said, though, the mosquito was our biggest enemy. Birds are amazing in a tropical world, and the flag that I showed you on the beginning, the national bird of New Guinea is the bird of paradise. It's a fantastic bird. I never saw one. These are rainbow lorikeets. The rainbow lorikeet is common to the whole area. It's very picturesque. And when I came back to the regiment after my trip, I was talking like this and showing this few pictures, and one second lieutenant looked at that and he said, "Geez, Dave, that looks like the COZO group." I'll never forget his comment on that. So there's the Corps. At the time, there were between 400 and 500 people. Basically, their role was national mapping, and then, of course, they extend off into assisting native countries. They were in Indonesia, and, of course, obviously, I'm talking about PNG. Their headquarters was in Canberra, the Australian Capital Territory. The regiment where I was posted to in Victoria, and the school was halfway between the two in Bonegilla, and then you can see all the field squadrons that they had spread around the country. So basically the field squadrons were the field surveyors, if you will, and the regiment was the mappers, if you want to look at it that way. And as I said, 1915 to 1996 when they folded the Corps. So here it is, enough background. This is the operation. We had 6 tasks to do, and I won't bore you with too many details about them all, but I will run through it, and I'll intersperse that with a bit of pictures of geography and people. So I'll start off with the Aerodist operation. Well, I guess first I'll start off with our squadron. What we had, it was a big operation. As I said, hundreds of people going up there to try to get this country mapped before the 1975 deadline. We had surveyors augmented from other squadrons. The SIGs in those days, the communication was with an ANGRC 106, the old Angry 106 set, so we used that from our main base to our forward operating base. The infantry was with us for camp discipline. They gave us a sergeant major. There was an officer in administration, and as I'll be explaining, the key thing was a survey assistant, one private 3 RER soldier with one sapper on a remote station. The Corps of Transport, Ordnance Corps, the medics were critical. We had a couple of really knowledgeable young people, guys from 11 Field Ambulance there, and I learned there are 5 strains of malaria. All of us got malaria, Mom included. Everybody got malaria. You just had to know what kind of malaria it was, and Vivax and Valciparin are the 2 worst kinds that are life-threatening. Valciparin mostly. So we had 2 cases of that, and they were medevaced immediately back to Australia in an urgent case. These were the guys that were on operations down in the mangrove swamps where you live with mosquitoes as part of life. The Ramie Corps was very significant to us because a lot of our equipment was very sensitive to survey equipment, and it was always breaking down. And there was a workshop that went in that were expert in dealing with our equipment, especially the Aerodist, and I'm going to talk about it first. We had wonderful cooks, as we do in the Arctic when we're on operations. The food was spectacular. And somehow I couldn't figure out the difference between the Australian Army and the RAAF because they both had fixed wing and rotary wing, and I could never figure out how they decided who got what. But from the Army Aviation Corps, we had 2 Pilatus Porter, a single-engine, small kind of recce aircraft, and it was fixed with cameras, and 4 Kiowa. So that was our maneuverability. The Air Force provided a Caribou, which is a younger cousin to the Buffalo. So that was our basic resupply aircraft that was constantly on the go. And 3 Iroquois. The Iroquois is their word for a Huey, except that post-Vietnam, they had all bought the first version, which was a single-engine Huey, and they were very envious of the Canadians because we had double-engine Hueys at the time. So for safety in this kind of area, that was a key factor. The Pacific Islands Regiment was with us to provide security because there was terrorism at the time. We were Army. We were in a country that was gaining independence. We lived inside barbed wire, and there were threats to the aircraft that we had and to the people. So the Pacific Island Regiment provided a platoon of troops who had the tough job of marching around the barbed wire every night to keep us all safe and secure. We had a couple of Americans with us because this is the precursor to GPS systems that I'll be explaining, and the state-of-the-art technology, 1974. and some of that equipment was mounted on two civilian Beechcraft Queen aircraft. We were allowed to hire 50 natives to do various parts of work, but we could only pay them $1 a day because we didn't want to ruin the local economy, so they told us. Won't go through that in detail. I just wanted to point out that's the org chart. Down here, this is our operational side, and that's the support side. Down here on our forward operating base, you see these little remotes there. That was a two-man team of one corporal surveyor and one survey assistant who was an infantryman. And I'll be explaining how critical that was to our operations. So start off in Goroka, where our base camp was. You can see the highlands up there. What's happening right now is that the remote survey party teams are getting themselves kitted out. You can see them. Every pile there is one set of equipment for the two-man team that's going to be shipped off into the boondocks. Obviously, everything comes up by Hercules to get us into country. Our main base was set up beside the airfield at Goroka. Once we got it going and got our barbed wire entanglement set up. You can see here, this is their caribou, very similar to a buffalo. These are the Pilatus Porter. That's a Kiowa here, there, and a couple of the Iroquois, the Hueys in the background. And overview of the camp. Everybody lived under canvas. That's our stores, QM stores, and that's one of the messes. In the back is ablutions back down there. And believe it or not, there's more power in a Bic pen today than there was in that computer, but that was all we had. And every single day when the surveyors come back, they'd give it to the WO2 there, and he'd have to punch in. They had a little, one or two little algorithms in there, and they have to punch in the data to verify whether or not the work they had done that day was good enough. Otherwise, it was back out and redo it again. So it was a really busy place, but all he had to do was punch numbers into that cranky old machine, and that's all the computing power we had. Now another look at the base and some of our aircraft. And the hangar we set up, that's one of the Ramey Tels trucks that we used to maintain the Aerodist equipment. So I'll get into this thing now. Just to give you a sense of what it is, a telluriometer is an electronic distance measuring device invented in South Africa, and it sends a microwave beam out. So between two stations, you can measure very precisely the difference between that point and that point. And what we did on the Aerodist, we didn't do this in Canada, but in Australia, what they do is that they put a survey party on one point, another on another point, and an aircraft loaded with telluriometers would fly between the two of them. So they're doing trilateration. So the distance from the aircraft would be, far closer, 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 and it'd be max at the closest point, and then away. So now we have a triangle that we can define, and if you know one point and another point, you can determine the coordinates of another point and all that kind of trigonometry. The aircraft would fly at different elevations between the two lines so that you would get the triangle with different shapes to it for the sense of the geometry to be solid. So the key thing is that the guys that were on the two-man party at each of those little points had to sit there for sometimes weeks at a time, just two guys sitting in a tent in the middle of the boondocks. Some of them we couldn't get to, and in that case we used a geoceiver, which I'll be talking about later. And we lost 2 helicopters on this operation. One of them, surveyors always like to go to the highest point of land, so there was a extinct volcano in the southern region, and of course there was a survey point on it. And when we tried to insert the teams, the helicopter put its skids up, and the updraft came, and down went the helicopter. So a couple of back injuries, but nobody was killed, but the helicopter was a write-off. The survey guys, normally their method of operation was to winch them in on the Kiowa to an area that had been pre-selected where we wanted a coordinate. So they'd be winched down, one surveyor, one infantryman, one radio, one rifle, and one bag of rice. And what would happen is when they landed there, before too long, a native would come through to see what was going on, and they would give the rice to the native to help them do the clearance. Because as you can imagine, if you're on the ground and you know in a certain angle an airplane is going to be flying or you're going to measure to, you have to cut the bush out in that line so that you've got line of sight to the aircraft, especially when it's on a low horizon. So there was a lot of bush hacking going on for the guys that were on the remote stations. A little diagrammatic sketch there so you can get the sense of trilateration. So all along the west is a border with Irian. You can see this is the coastline of the northern part of New Guinea. This is the southern port, Torres Strait, and the border runs straight down there. Part of our job was to better define the border with Indonesia. So every one of those points we put down a two-man party, and they'd sit there for time to listen to these signals. And there's a forward base down in the southern area. We'd obviously moved our forward bases around. This one is on the Fly River. And you can see the base set up with their camps and their Iroquois helicopters. This is a typical setup with the two-man with their tent and ablutions. And this one is actually a geoceiver over there and a generator. And that's basically all they had for 6 or 8 months. This is kind of the fellows in the, you can see that's where he has the shower over there. And sometimes rather than cutting the clearance, you would want to put your point up elevated. So we have to build these towers. You can see a tripod on the top up there to put the telluriometer on. The story I'm about to tell you, my wife is convinced it's fiction, but I'm trying my best to convince her that it's not fiction, it's true. This is the mangrove swamp, they call it. You can see the meandering river there. It's the Fly River in the south. And a photogrammetrist in the regiment would say, I want a point there. And I want another one there. So we'd have to winch these guys in, but the ground is very unstable there, because if you know what mangrove looks like, so the tree that has the roots that kind of hang down like this, and then the canopy above it. So we would winch the two-man team down, and then they would start to clear the bush. And then what would happen was, because it's all totally covered with that canopy, it was a natural place for the crocodiles to come out and sun themselves, because they never saw the sun otherwise. So believe it or not, these two guys would live in a hammock in the mangroves above the crocodiles that were slithering around underneath them all day long, waiting for an aircraft to come by. And this is a slide I got that kind of shows you how they felt. But it is a true story, and that's what these guys had to go through, and sometimes they'd be living in that hammock for 4 days to 2 weeks before we got enough measurements on the lines before we can pull the guys out and move them on to the next area. So enough of that. That was the geoceiver. A little bit about the country. I've already talked about it. Just some pictures. In the southern part, I showed you that mangrove swamp thing. You can see miles and miles and miles and miles. No elevation, no nothing. And just packed with mosquitoes. Packed. And crocodiles everywhere, of course, and snakes. So it was, for a Canadian from the Arctic, it was quite a change. Here's the sort of bush canopy in the highland area. And some of the villages that we came across. In the tropics, of course, houses, even in Australia, they don't have, David would know this, they don't have basements. They elevate their houses on props because it allows the air to blow underneath, and that's the only sort of cooling effect that they can get. So very common with the grass huts in New Guinea. The other thing in the highlands, when we had to do a resupply, it was our caribou that did that. And you can see this little airstrip by a village. You know, there is danger at this end, and there's danger at that end because it's a straight fall off. So if you overshoot, you're done. Later on, I can tell you about this native culture cult called a cargo cult that came from World War II, which is very bizarre. I'll go into it now. And these, we had 2 squadrons with us when we were there. They switched halfway through. One was the guys that had been to Vietnam, and the other one was the instructional school. And the pilot's mentality was totally different. The Vietnam guys were cowboys, and the school guys were all about the rules, the regulations, and the safety, and this and that and the other. So we had to adapt. One day, one of the cowboys from the Vietnam guys decided to take me out for a ride around, and as I said, it's the Ring of Fire, and they saw a volcano blowing up, so they thought we should go and have a look. He took me to it, and he went right down on the inside of it, right on the inside of that thing, and we got out just in time. So I lived to tell the tale. So it was a great time taking that nervous picture out of the side of that Iroquois helicopter. So that was geoceiver. Now I'll go on to vertical control and field completion. As you might expect, a trilateration business is very good at giving you horizontal coordinates, latitude and longitude. So we're trying to fix that. The other dimension is the vertical. So what's your altitude above sea level? Field completion just means that the regiment had drawn maps from aerial photography, but we need to ground truth them. So we would actually go in with a plot that had been done on a machine in Bendigo, and we need to go out and ground truth to say, well, he thinks that that's a village, is it really a village, and all that kind of stuff. So we do that final check before we turn it into a map. Altimetric heighting is a very loose way of calculating heights. Again, this is way before GPS days, and the Australians, not being, in NATO, our standard map scales were 50 and 250. In Australia, because they were mapping their country, they mapped at the scale of 1 in 100,000, which is what was here. So the difference between a 50,000 scale map and a 100,000 scale map is that you do not need the accuracy to map at a smaller scale like that than you do for the tactical scale maps, as we would call it. So altimetric heighting was a good way to go, adequate for the accuracy that we were after. There were 8 maps. I think I got a... This is a little thing I pulled off the UNB website talking about barometric. As you know, a column of air over any point on the Earth has a weight to it, so at sea level it weighs more than if you're at 15,000 feet, it weighs less. So that altimetric sense dealing with your environmental conditions, the ambient temperatures, humidity, et cetera, you can do a calculation to tell you what the height is. It's a very quick and probably very poor explanation. Here you can see that similar diagram where you can see the red squares are, each one of those is a 100,000 scale map. So we would, again with no roads, we had to fly them in Kiowa to overfly the maps to make sure the ground was depicted correctly. And all the little green dots on the left is everywhere where we required, the regiment required a vertical control point. So they would stop down there with their Wallace and Tiernan altimeters and land and do their sensitive readings and then take off to the next point. And there's how we do it. It was all done. See, these guys managed to turn the drums upright, so that's a step forward. And a lot of it was along the Fly River, so we had to rig up the Kiowas with the floats because we were flying over water. So, a little diversion now. The main camp was in this place called Goroka, and there's a river going by it called the Asaro River. And there's a particular village there that's quite well known, and it's called the Mudmen Village. And the huts behind it are very typical. That's where people live, and they had fires going on the inside. The dogs and the pigs live with them. They have names. They're treated like children. This particular village had once been attacked by a neighboring village, and all of the people from the Asaro village rushed back into the river to escape the attacking hordes. When they came back out, it turns out there's a white clay in that river. When they came back out, they were all covered with this white clay in their counterattack, and it scared the bejesus out of the other guys because they thought they were the ghosts of the people that they had chased away. So they now have a ceremonial reenactment of that particular thing where they all dress up, get on their white mud, and come out with the mask and kind of scare away the visitors. And that's what a Canadian looks like amongst all of that bunch. And the hat does fit. So it is me. And there's a guy playing a susap, as they called it. So that's that was a lot of fun when we did have time off. The next two things are air photography and laser APR. Air photography, when you select that point and put it in the ground with a little unique number on it, you can't see it from space. So what you have to do is to put some big white banners on either side of it to make an X out of it, and fly over top of it with a camera and take a picture of that. That picture at that scale will then be transferred onto the mapping photography, and that's how you move that unique coordinate from the ground onto a photograph, which eventually is going to become a map. Just a little explanation there. That we still did in Canada. That operation was called Operation Sky Pixa. The language that they spoke there is Pidgin. It's a mixture of German and Dutch and English, and it was a lingua franca. Although there were 800 different languages, if you needed to communicate, you'd talk to them in Pidgin. And if you listen to Pidgin long enough, it's kind of like Robbie Burns, and it's really hard to read it word by word, but if you listen to it for a while, you can get the sense of what's going on. Sky Pixa means aerial photography, sky picture. And the Australians had these old Canberra bombers from World War II they'd used in Vietnam, and they had no role for it whatsoever. So they're very happy that we had a role for it, because although it took up about 10 miles of airstrip just to get off the ground, once it got airborne, it was very stable, and it was a beautiful platform for an aerial survey camera. APR is a thing that was Airborne Profile Recorder. It was invented in Canada at the National Research Council here in Ottawa, and had been used extensively in Canada. An aircraft would fly and send down a audible signal and wait for the rebound and calculate the amount of time it took to send the message down before you got the rebound. You can if you know the height of the aircraft, you can figure out the height of the ground. The Australians had gone, with their research institute, had gone one step further, saying, why don't we send a laser down? It's much more accurate, and we should get a better result. So this was a field trial, if you will, of that new technology. And that's a Canberra bomber. As you can see, it's a real old-style beast, but it was perfect for us, for the platform that we wanted. You can see it's riding on pure steel planking. That's make up airstrips in the tropics that were used extensively during the war. And I think there's even some pieces of it lying around on the west coast of British Columbia today. But it was a great, we didn't have much to do with that operation. That was run by the RAAF, independent of my survey operation. This is the Pilatus Porter, and I think that's a Zeiss camera in there. So you can see it takes up pretty well all of the available space, so there'd just be room for a pilot and then the camera operator in the back. And he had that role of flying over those points I was telling you about once they had been measured and marked. So enough of that, and back to these guys again. As I explained, you just can't get it in your head that people still live like they did thousands and thousands of years ago, and they do. And they're very wary people, and it's interesting that the men were always made out with all of the flowers and makeup and all, and women are always very, very plain. And the men, even in our main camp, when we had a bag of onions, you know the little red bag that onions came in, the guys had all put it on their head because they thought it looked cool to have that orange, because they didn't have anything orange. And you can see that she's wearing all of those shells because she's in the Highlands. She's a Highlander. So the value, I mean, she's a very rich, very influential person, because the shells don't exist, of course, up in the Highlands. So to be able to have that would show. And that's typically how they would all dress, men and women. And we were in the village of Goroka. This is I took it on market day, and you can see the bows and arrows and stuff. There were coffee plantations around, so a lot of them were hired to work picking coffee beans and whatever. And this is what we called a boy truck. And it's interesting, in Pidgin colonial days, the word for a man and a woman and child was boy, Mary, and pickaninny. So a man was actually called a boy in the colonial Pidgin language. So this is why they call that a boy truck. And there's some of them coming back from the market day. This old guy here, you can see the influence of Christianity in so a lot of religious folks try to get into this country to convert them, and it caused total chaos in my view, from what I observed. I took this picture because this guy, instead of wearing the grass, you know, that they cut this kunai grass and they would hang it around their waist. We called it ass grass, because after it got dirty, they would just take it off and cut down some more kunai grass, and they got a new set of clothes, right? This guy, he's got a beer mat hanging off his gut. I thought that was cool. And there's a Mary and her pickaninny. They're wonderful people in the way they value family life. This is the market. That's sugar cane. And I need to go back because it's very important to talk about the role of pigs in their life. When the tribes were fighting each other and there was a war, the solution of it in the end was peace, and the most important chief would slaughter a lot of pigs. And the more pigs he could slaughter, the more it showed the other guys how he was more powerful than the neighboring tribe. So they would have these wars, they'd shoot bows and arrows at each other, and then they would have this big party that would take weeks to celebrate the victory by slaughtering all of these pigs. And that says in Pidgin, buy 'em pig here. So that means you want to buy a pig, this is where you go. And there's a couple of gals coming in on market day. Here's a couple of pickaninnies. They said they were always laughing. I had no idea what they're talking about, but every time we came across the folks, they were always in a good mood. This is a little bit of the ancestor worship. There's lots of things about ancestors. There's some pretty gross things. I won't go into a lot of detail. I was Googling it the other night because that's part of the origin of cannibalism, is to consume the remains of your dead family to keep all of the strength within the tribe. So that's one of the reasons that shrunken heads comes up and cannibalism comes up. The other thing is that if you were victorious over a neighboring tribe, they would keep the skull and they would sleep on it at night so that their head on top of the other skull would keep the ghosts of that tribe down and they wouldn't attack again. So these are kind of cultural things that happened in a country like that. and that is a human head. Of course, what they do is that they actually take the skull out of the head, and so that all you've got is the skin left, and they would boil that and shrink it. And that also cleaned it up, if you will. And then they would paint it to try to look like the person that originally was. And this one, I can tell you, was a Papuan, because having spent a lot of time there, I could tell where people were from just by looking at them. And they were very typically long, flat nose, pointed like that. To guarantee that that's used to be a Papuan. So my final bit is on the geoceiver. This is a forerunner of GPS. And it was the old Transit satellite system, the Navy navigation satellite system. You haven't heard me talk about it before. It's the origin of GPS because submarines rolling around the Pacific Ocean didn't know where they were. So the U.S. Navy had to come up with a way to, because you couldn't send a missile anywhere without knowing where you are to start with before you target the end. So the Transit system was a solution to that. Surveyors picked up on that right away because we said, hey, well, if you can figure out where you are in the middle of the Pacific, I can refine that and find out exactly where I am, latitude, longitude, and elevation. The trouble was in 1974, it was brand new, and we only had one satellite per day or two passing over. So we had these predictions. And we'd have to send our parties out, same two guys. And the difference here is that when you dropped them down for a geoceiver station, for the geoceiver station, when I talked about the other one, the Aerodis, you had to cut out a line where you knew where the plane was coming. And this, the satellite, you don't know where it's going to come. So they had to cut a great big, huge, wide circle around the, so the soldiers didn't like that because it was like 10 times the work when you had to sit down. And then we would give them a predictive orbit and let them know when the satellite was coming up that they had to receive. So it took 40 successful passes to get a good solid result, and 12, and sometimes it was only one day, hopefully, that you get a good signal. So a lot of time spent on station, if you will. There's a map showing where the locations were, a lot of them down in the southern part, in the swamps again, that same story I told you before. And that's what the equipment looked like at this end. He's got a clock there because the precise ephemeral time is the most important factor because you need to capture that signal. It's a UHF signal coming down to the station. It's a similar, I won't go into the technical. And that's what the receiver looks like. So that's the end of my talk. I just wanted to finish on a kind of a humorous note. In Pidgin, gumi stands for rubber. And the shoes that you used to wear were called gummy shoes because they're normally made of rubber flip-flop kind of material. And that's how you write New Guinea if you wanted to do it native style. And once a year down the Asaro River where the mudmen were, there was this big gummy race, which means that everybody that's participating had to build a raft. It had to float on rubber, and you had to get down this river a great long distance ahead of everybody else. Counter to that, every time you crossed a bridge or there were people on shore watching it, this was a big event, you were pelted constantly with rotten tomatoes and eggs and all that kind of gross stuff that had been stored for months in a bucket somewhere. So this is the beginning of the gummy race. We're all getting ourselves organized to go down. You can see the Le Mans start as we all race off into the river. And a couple of smoke bombs in there. And even got helicopters to drop the good stuff on top of the people that were going down in the race. So you can see these guys that was one of the local airlines up there, Tal Air, and they're kind of suffering already and they're just getting started. This is one of the boats. These guys were prepared for the rotten egg bombing event, so they brought out, the yellow and green is the color of the beer that everybody drank there, South Pacific Lager, so there's only one beer available. A little side story in our mess, every time you got a beer, you'd always go like this, because all the ones that had a dead mouse in it, you'd put on top of the fridge, and then when the time came to go back to the store, you get one free beer for every beer that had a dead mouse in it. Not the greatest stuff in the world. Those are our SIGs guys. Those are our ordnance stores guys. And that's how you ended up. You got at the end and you had a can of South Pacific sitting in the river. I was quite impressed with the Australian haircut rules at the time because you were allowed to have sideburns in the Australian Army at the time. I thought that was cool. And in Pidgin, when you end something, you say, Emi Tassal. That's all. So that's the end of my story, folks. Thank you very much. turn this thing off.